What do famous scientist Marie Curie, lead singer of The Doors Jim Morrison, and celebrated writer Victor Hugo have in common? No, this is not the start of some macabre joke. These are just some of the people buried throughout Paris's graveyards. You may be wondering, why are graveyards so important? And why has Paris become the resting place for so many famous people? In this video, we will discuss the change in funeral practice which happened in the 19th century, as well as the reasons behind some of the most well-known celebrities buried in the city. Anne Carroll from Marseille University compiled a recent academic article on embalming and the materiality of death in 19th century France. Based on her research, she found that at the end of the 1830s, embalming became fashionable in France. The new private form of embalming concerned ordinary people who could not bear seeing their past beloved ones decompose and decay to dust. This rise went hand in hand with the multiplication of timeless plots allocated within cemetaries. This is important to note, as we did in case 3, because now more bodies were being preserved and people were thinking of the body as an object after death. It was more permanent, whereas in the past, moving graves, acknowledging the decaying corpse, these were things that were taken for granted. It was a natural cycle of death. Describing the funeral transition from allowing the remains to decompose and revering the gravesite, our brand states, "The concern for the dead was not characterized by the concern for their soul, but rather for the material remains. The cult of the dead focused on the grave in the 19th century. Embalming was perhaps a necessary step within this materialization. During a limited period of time, the certainty of having a fully preserved body under the grave was necessary in order to function as a place of memory and as a cornerstone of the cult of the dead." This is an interesting shift in popularity, and it coincided with the dawn of the Industrial Revolution throughout Europe. In 1839, Boitard writes, "One could not get separated from a cherished object, but rather rescue it from the tombstone's void to keep watching, talking to, and loving it. One would be pleased to keep wishful thinking, reanimate through those insensitive remains, to awaken them with love, to return them to the effective sensitivity of memories." At this time, romantic writers such as Charlotte Bronte were creating works of fiction that captured the emotion of true love and life after death. Maybe none more so than her sister Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights. The writers of the time began to scrutinise death and its rituals in the Western world, tapping into popular practices. Victor Hugo, regarded as one of the best-known and greatest French writers of all time, was a leading figure of the Romantic literary movement. The Last Day of a Condemned Man famously recounts the thoughts of a man condemned to die. Hugo's religious views changed radically over the course of his life. In his youth, and under the influence of his mother, he identified as a Catholic and professed respect for the church hierarchy and authority. Then, from there, he became a non-practicing Catholic and increasingly expressed anti-Catholic and anti-clerical views. He frequented Spiritism during his exile, where he participated in many seances conducted by Madame Delphine de Girardin. Yet, he believed in life after death, but prayed every single morning and night. He wrote many poems speaking about religion, even denying the usefulness of churches. In previous centuries, even decades before his time, this kind of free thinking would have been considered heresy, and dissension would mean that the culprit was ostracized from society or branded a heathen, maybe even a witch, especially in the case of a woman. However, Victor Hugo and his peers managed to have their works published and were widely read by the population of France and abroad. Now, his body rests at the Pantheon in the heart of Paris, and his grave is a popular attraction for literary lovers. This shift in culture may seem quick for us looking back, as we categorize history into centuries and decades. Yet at the time, it would not have seemed so immediate. Slowly, families would make different choices to that of their parents or grandparents when it came to their burial preferences. This way, over several decades, we see graves becoming more prominent in the final moments of the funeral service, and mourners within the church saying goodbye at the coffin side begin to dwindle. Working class people started to have elaborate graves and memorials in their honour. If you live in Europe, I'm sure you will notice that a lot of the cemeteries and graveyards have tombs, statues and stonework which are distinctly 19th century. The funerary cult surrounding death in France at that time was firmly based in Catholicism. This was reflected in the designs found on the grave markers. Have you ever been inside a Catholic church? They are beautiful, ostentatious and ornate. If you compare this to other orders of Christianity, such as the Church of England or Protestant, these places of worship still look impressive, but the decoration is usually toned down, with a lot less gold leaf being used. Death and Afterlife in Modern France by Thomas A. Selman explains that during the 19th century in France, Catholicism was forced to compete with a number of different visions of the afterlife. These alternatives were proposed by philosophers and social theorists who looked back to the 18th century and beyond for their inspiration. And despite the innovations that they introduced, their debt to the past is generally clear. But, unlike in the previous century, criticism and discussion about the afterlife was not limited to an intellectual elite. In the 19th century, alternative afterlives were part of a public debate that took place in newspapers and journals. So why choose Paris as your final resting place? Firstly, you may not have a choice. If you were a citizen, then it's likely that you will already have had a family burial plot allocated for you, or you will have a place at a cemetery local to your house. There are currently 14 cemeteries in Paris, and they date back hundreds of years, so in the 19th century, you would have had easy access to a plot. Choosing to be buried in a single place for eternity was part of the new funeral practice. Previously, bones would be moved to make way for new corpses. In 1786, bodies began to be moved from graveyards like Les Innocents to the ossuary that is contained within the Paris Catacombs. The catacombs themselves used to be limestone quarries, and with over 200 miles of tunnels beneath the city streets, it was an easy solution to begin removing bones from the overflowing cemeteries and interring them in the disused, plentiful caverns. A century later, and Paris would once again question how their graveyards would cope with an influx of embalmed people whose bodies would not crumble and rot in the coffins. After all, there's a vast difference between moving the bare bones of a skeleton and moving an entire corpse as well as their preserved heavy wooden coffin. To ease the pressure on the burial infrastructure, garden cemeteries were built outside of Paris with larger grounds, and as cremation came into fashion in recent decades, less bodies are buried in general. So, if the first reason for being buried in Paris is that you live there, what's another? Well, it could be that you are a famous member of society and you wish to be buried in a capital city where your grave will become a shrine for family members and visitors alike. Scientist Louis Pasteur, who invented the pasteurization process, was buried in the grounds of Notre Dame Cathedral, then moved to his permanent resting place in the Pasteur Institute, which had been founded in his name in 1888. There is another famous Louis buried in Paris, Louis Braille. He was the inventor of the Braille language, now used by blind and partially sighted people the world over. He was a teacher and was himself blind due to a childhood accident. He's buried at the Pantheon alongside other pioneers such as Marie Curie, the first woman to win a Nobel Prize for Physics. She died in 1934 and became the first woman to be interred at the Pantheon. Other than the Pantheon, most visitors come to pay their respects at Père Lachaise Cemetery, which has been featured in famous French literature by Balzac, Alexandre Dumas, Victor Hugo, and Gustave Flaubert. One of its most notable residents is Victor Noir, who died in 1870. He was a French journalist, and his death was quite dramatic. In December 1869, a month before his death, a dispute broke out between two Corsican newspapers. They had different political views and would often publish letters from people of authority which supported their arguments. One day, a letter was sent to the newspaper L'Avenir de la Corse from Prince Pierre Bonaparte, the nephew of Napoleon and cousin of Emperor Napoleon III, who by then had ruled for more than 20 years. Prince Bonaparte rebuked the opposing newspaper, La Revanche, for having a staff of cowards and traitors. La Revanche was considered to be a radical publication. A month later, in January 1870, Napoleon was still furious with La Revanche, believing that their articles had constantly ridiculed and insulted his family members throughout the years. So he wrote to their head office. "After having outraged each of my relations, you insult me with the pen of one of your menials? My turn had to come. Only I have an advantage over the others of my name, of being a private individual, while being a Bonaparte. I therefore ask you whether your inkpot is guaranteed by your breast. I live not in a palace, but at 59 Rue de Retoil. I promise to you that if you present yourself, you will not be told that I left." In short, he was telling them to send someone to his home so that he could organise an official duel, testing whether the pen was truly mightier than the sword. So, On the following day, the head of the newspaper sent journalists Victor Noir and Ulrich de Fonvielle, his representatives, to fix the term of a duel with Pierre Bonaparte. Contrary to custom, they presented themselves directly to Prince Bonaparte himself, instead of contacting his representatives. Each of the journalists carried a revolver in his pocket. Noir and de Fonvielle presented Prince Bonaparte with a letter signed by their boss. But the prince declined the challenge, asserting his willingness to fight his fellow nobleman Rochefort, who owned the newspaper, but not his menials. In response, Noir asserted his solidarity with his friends. According to his fellow journalist and eyewitness Fonvielle, Prince Bonaparte then slapped Noir's face and shot him dead. But according to the prince, it was Noir who took umbrage at being called a menial and struck him first, whereupon the prince drew his own revolver and fired at his aggressor. Of course, that was the version which was eventually accepted by the court. Victor Noir's grave is a life-size bronze statue laying down, portrayed in a realistic style, as though he had just fallen on the street, dropping his hat, which is depicted beside him. By looking at this photo, can you tell what bizarre folklore emerged after his death? The myth states that by placing a flower in the upturned top hat, after kissing the statue on the lips and rubbing its genital area, this will enhance your fertility, bring a blissful sex life, or in some versions, a husband within a year. Even the tips of his shoes have been polished by women, hoping for some truth in this modern legend. As you can see from this example, although the rituals surrounding burial within France have changed over the years, there is still an unbreakable tie to the past. There will always be a part of humanity that associates death with mystery and places spiritual superstition on the symbolism of a corpse.